Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today on the show, we have Janice Phillips and Katie Boston Leary. Janice is an associate professor at the College of Nursing at Rush University and the director of nursing research and health equity. Katie is the director of nursing programs at the American Nurses Association, and together they wrote the Kevin MD article, Nurses Are in Need of Racial Healing. Janice and Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask each of you just to briefly share your stories and journeys to where you are today. Janice, why don't you go?
I'm Janice Phillips, and I've been a nurse for a number of decades now and was very excited to be selected to be on the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing. I personally have experienced racism in nursing, but was a little surprised to know that it was as widespread as it is. I mean, I think my colleagues and my friends that are in the profession, we all have our own stories, but it's pretty disturbing to know that our profession is being plagued with such widespread racism. And my colleague and I, Dr. Boston Leary, decided to try to leverage more platforms to get the word out about racism in nursing.
Perfect. And we're going to be talking about that article in a little bit. But before we do, Katie, just briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Poe. So I've been a nurse as well for a couple of decades. I hate doing that description, but specifically 28 years and worked through the ranks. My specialty was the operating room and then got into executive leadership. And now after I got my doctorate, I wanted to do something along the lines of social change and broader impact. So the American Nurses Association found me as much as I found them. And it's been a nice marriage. And that's when we tackle issues like this. Racism in nursing, staffing, you name it, anything that is impacting the nursing profession and gives us the opportunity to leverage resources and get some political attention. That's what we do. So I also teach at the University of Maryland, which is also something that I love. So that's me, and I'm excited to be here.
All right, so let's get into that article that both of you wrote. It's titled, Nurses Are in Need of Racial Healing. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read that article, Janice, could you just briefly share the story of why both of you decided to write it and summarize it for my audience?
Absolutely, and thank you, Dr. Poe. The National Commission to Address Racism is a collective of a number of our leading nursing organizations and minority nursing organizations. Conducted a survey of about 5,600 nurses to get their perspectives around racism. And the findings show that we have a problem. 63% of those who responded reported having experienced some form of racism, mainly by their peers or their managers or their supervisors. And the report sends a clarion call to all members of our profession that this will not be tolerated. Racism, as we all know, undermines some of our most treasured values. Our core values are built around respect and caring and compassion. And so the report hopefully will help to intensify those, not only just those conversations, but those actions around addressing the problem that we see in our profession right now. When the report came out, Katie and I decided to do whatever we could to utilize more outlets, whether it be social media platforms or whatever it would be, to get the word out, to issue a stronger call to action. And I'm hoping that anyone who's listening today will be very curious to read the report, but also take a good look at themselves individually and collectively to see what we can do to address this issue.
And Janice, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that it was surprising the extent of racism within the nursing profession. Why was it surprising?
Well, when you think about on a personal level, I've experienced racism. I have colleagues, and after 4 decades in the profession, I know it exists. But to see the numbers and to see that there's a lot more discussion around racism, I can never recall any time in my 4 decades of practice have we ever turned our attention to racism. Now we have the data, we have the evidence, we have the testimonies. So it's not just my own personal perspective. It's not just the perspective of my colleagues that I work with every day or throughout my career. It's the perspectives and the real experiences of a large number of nurses, which makes it really, really troubling. Not an isolated incident, not all in my mind, not all in my head that maybe it's just me. There's a large number of nurses who are experiencing racism.
And Katie, one of the things that Janice mentioned was that a lot of the racism comes from peers and managers. I was wondering, can you share some stories that you hear from other nurses that really paints a picture about some of the scenarios of racism so my audience can really kind of understand what's going on?
Sure, sure. And I can actually add in some of what I experienced, but it's interesting because we started off with doing listening sessions, and those listening sessions were quite revealing because that's how we dipped our toes into understanding the landscape, what was going on. And we heard stories that when you hear it, you would think that it was something that played out probably in the civil rights era during that struggle, but it's happening today. We had a nurse who's explained to us tearfully about how her assignment got switched because her patient didn't want her in the room. And when she asked her and she knew that there was a dynamic that was going on, but she was fulfilling her social contract to care for anyone and everyone because of, that's what we do as nurses. And her supervisor pulled her out of the room and switched her assignment, and she was dismayed at that. And when she asked, tell me what's going on, why is this happening? Is it me? Her supervisor told her that, well, don't blame the patient because at night when you come in, when you smile, all he sees are your teeth. And that scares him. There are other stories around, nurses where they have a fear of even taking a break or going to lunch because their settings on their vents or their drips will be changed because of an effort to get them out because they're not quote unquote fitting in. The impression also, and I've had conversations with some of the Black nurses around this, where culturally we're taught to not eat everybody's food and watch who you engage with socially. And because of that, because they're not engaging in potlucks, they're seen as not being team players and they're excluded and weeded out. And sadly, because of some of the stories, all of these trends in these stories, you find that a lot of our nurses of color are reducing the relationships they have with their managers and their peers to being purely transactional, which is not where we want to be, right? It's about, okay, if you're not going to love on me, if nursing's not going to love me back, at least I earn a living. And that's all I'm going to reduce this relationship to. So our goal is to lift and rise above that, right, with this work and make sure that it's understood that, yes, it's hard, but we have our work cut out for us, but we are relentless and we're going to continue to raise the issue that this is real. And unfortunately, we do have a good segment of nurses that are saying that this is all political and why are we doing this? So that's the truth and reckoning that has to happen for this to take effect, for us to move towards racial healing.
And Dr. Poe, I'd like to add that this is across all levels of nursing. You think, well, you've got a PhD or you've got some extra credentials or extra alphabets, behind your name. And even for me, with as many years of experience and academia and practice and research, but we are not exempt from racism. It's not just the bedside nurse. It's the nurse executive. It's the nurse that has advanced education. It's across all levels of roles and settings.
So Janice, give us an example in the nurse executive setting, stories that you hear of racism in that setting.
Well, let me give an example with myself. I remember having earned my PhD and I was in Washington, D.C., and I was all excited about my first interview for a position to serve as a consultant for a nationally recognized nursing organization. When I showed up at the front desk for my interview, the front desk clerk said, the temporary secretaries, they check in upstairs. Now, mind you, I was dressed in a nice suit, my briefcase. I don't know what gave that person the impression that an African-American woman, any African-American woman who came to that desk at that moment had to be the temporary secretary. And I was a little offended by that, but I was also taken aback because I really wasn't sure how to address that. I was a nurse who was relatively new with a PhD degree, very well credentialed with many, many years of experience and expertise, and even national visibility. But to have someone approach me like that was very, very disturbing.
Yeah. I can echo that too, to piggyback on that experience. As a chief nursing officer, and this was not that long ago, and it was at an institution that I was working at in Maryland, which is pretty diverse. And I was a chief nursing officer there, and my secretary was white. And whenever we walked in a room together, of whether external people or people that are looking for positions, they would always gravitate to her because of the fact that she was white. And it was something that we ended up laughing over after we got over the how often it occurred. But it became a game for us. Like, watch this. We know it's going to happen again. And they would always shake her hand first, and when we're both walking in the room together.
Katie, if a nurse experiences an episode of racism, what kind of recourse does he or she have? What are the next steps?
That's a great question. And Kevin, we actually just received a call in our hotline about a nurse that said, because of the work that we're doing, that said, the recording was this, I like to report, hello, ANA, my name is so and so, and I like to report racism that I'm experiencing in my school of nursing. And my initial response was, go through the proper channels within your institution and report it and escalate it if you don't see results. And Janice hit on the numbers in terms of the fact that 64% of our respondents said that there's no proper follow-up when they report incidents of racism. So when I thought about that response, I said, well, is that the right response? Because you do find, again, with that data, that the follow-up is not as effective, right? It doesn't necessarily get to the heart of the matter. And there's an avoidance too. And right fragility is real as well. We hear it even yesterday when we were conducting some Project Echo sessions to talk about scenarios of racism. And there is a defending that comes out about, my husband is Black, my friend is Black. Oh, I know this person. They would never do this, blah, blah, blah. So it is a tough question. Of course, you have to start in the organization and manage it through those the policy structures and things like that. But those structures are not sound, which is why a lot of what we're trying to enforce is that we have to look at these policies. It's less about the person next to you and their beliefs and trying to change them. It's really about focusing on these policies and the structural racism that exists that prevents people from raising these issues. So it's long-winded, but it's a very complicated answer, but you have to start within the institution. And that comes with a risk, but that's where you have to start.
So Janice, let me ask you a similar question in terms of next steps. So what should be the next steps that institutions should implement now that you brought attention to the commission's findings? Medical institutions, after they read these findings, what are the next steps they should do?
Well, I think also on an individual level first, we all could benefit from a little bit of self-reflection, self-assessment, if you will. What are our own internal biases? I think we have a little bit of homework to do on an individual level. But on a broader level, on an organizational level, we'd like to say, don't put your head in the sand. This is real. Read the report. Figure out what you need to do to make sure that everybody feels welcome, included, and respected. We expect that our nurses will deliver stellar care to our diverse populations. They cannot do that if they're dealing with the racism themselves. Either they are exhibiting racist behaviors themselves, or they are perpetuating racism in the organization. And again, in alignment with what Katie said, we need to look at our policies, but we need to be able to come front and center and have these critical and crucial conversations. There's no time like the present, and we cannot continue to say, oh, that's just an isolated incident, or it's all in their head. It's very real. We have the evidence, we have the data. Let's have a collective conversation, but more importantly, let's figure out what we need to do from a policy perspective. There's no room for racism in nursing and in health.
So Janice, I want to follow up in terms of one of the things you said, that from an individual level, there should be some self-reflection. So what exactly would that look like? Are there any resources that you could point my audience to?
There are a number of resources, self-assessment tools on the American Nurses Association webpage. There are resources, there are toolkits that individuals can take to look at their own individual implicit bias. Thankfully, our nursing organizations and our healthcare organizations are now requiring that individuals take these types of assessments. There's legislation right here in our own state that says that we have to be much more aware of these issues. And so there are tools out there. We just have to be willing and open to using them. And let that be the fuel to help us be better prepared to have these larger conversations. We need to empower ourselves. We need to empower others. And when we see things happening, not to sound cliche, if you see something, say something, but if we see something, we have to be able to say something. But it all starts with ourselves on the individual level first.
We're talking to Janice Phillips and Katie Boston Leary. They wrote the Kevin MD article, Nurses Are in Need of Racial Healing. Now I'm going to ask each of you for your take-home messages to the Kevin MD audience. Katie, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so my take-home message is really to understand that, and Janice hit this, we all have biases and we're all learning. And I think if we start with that place of humility to understand that this is something we're all experiencing and going through, and there's grace in this process to understand everyone's viewpoints, and also recognize that we all have to do our parts and not put it upon others to learn more and learn what there is to learn, because that's part of what we're seeing too. Educate me, like there's so many tools out there, to Janice's point, and you have to start there and not make it someone else's responsibility to educate you. Once you have some more information about where you should be and what you need to do, then you take it forward to having a really crucial conversations around this issue. But it's really important to understand that this is an issue in nursing. This is not made up. We have the data, qualitative and quantitative, they indicate that it is, and there's an urgency for us to deal with it. Then we can get past it and get to a point of healing and transformation.
Janice, what are some of your take-home messages?
I could have said it better. I say, read the report, take it seriously. And for those nurses who are experiencing racism, know that they are not alone. There are now increasing forums and platforms to talk about this, to get some support, to help become better educated. And like Katie said, I think all of us play a role in terms of addressing racism in nursing. And we want to do our very best to make sure that we are preserving those core values of compassion, caring, and respect for all people. That includes our colleagues as well.
Janice and Katie, thank you so much for your time and sharing your insight.
Thank you for having us.